When people think of Dan Blocker, the first image that comes to mind is usually that of Hoss Cartwright, the burly, lovable character from the iconic Western series Bonanza. With his towering height, massive frame, and booming laugh, Blocker seemed like the kind of man who was born to play a cowboy. But what most fans never knew is that behind the scenes, Dan was anything but a stereotypical Western tough guy. In fact, there was one very unexpected passion in his life that shocked even his closest friends. A hobby so different from his rugged on-screen persona, it made people question everything they thought they knew about the man. At the height of his fame, Dan Blocker could have easily embraced the Hollywood lifestyle, luxury, spotlight, and non-stop attention. Yet, he chose something much more low-key and adrenaline-fueled. Instead of wild parties or predictable celebrity excess, Dan found peace, joy, and grounding through something that had nothing to do with acting or fame. The very hobby that kept him centered and humble wasn't just unexpected. It was thrilling, deeply personal, and quietly defiant of the image TV had carved out for him. For a man who was once declared too large for the Army to equip properly, and who could out-eat nearly anyone on set, it's hard to imagine him hunched over a piece of finely tuned machinery or hurtling down a racetrack at insane speeds. But that's exactly where Dan Blocker found his freedom. While millions tuned in every week to watch him bumble his way through ranching dilemmas as the lovable Hoss, in real life, Dan was racing high-performance sports cars, tinkering with powerful engines, and studying the intricacies of torque, speed, and traction. But how does a man like that, an actor known for playing a cowboy, end up obsessed with race cars and engineering? And what drove him to spend his private time focused on something so far removed from the dusty trails of the Ponderosa? The answer lies not just in what Dan did for fun, but in the kind of person he truly was when the cameras stopped rolling. Dan Blocker's surprising hobby wasn't just a way to kill time. It was an extension of the quiet complexity he carried through life. Fans often saw the friendly, slow-talking cowboy, but his real-life story is filled with contradictions. A soldier who despised violence, a Hollywood star who hated the spotlight, a teacher-turned-TV icon who remained grounded through a world of horsepower and speed. And this hidden passion, it's more than just a fun fact. It's a window into how he stayed sane, stayed real, and stayed true to himself despite the pressures of fame. But to understand why this hobby meant so much to him, we first have to go back to a time before the fame, before Bonanza, when Dan Blocker's life took a sharp, unforgettable turn. Because before he ever gripped a steering wheel, Dan held something far heavier in his hands, and what he experienced next would shape him forever. Before the bright lights of Hollywood and the roar of a high-performance engine ever entered Dan Blocker's life, there was something darker, something that stayed with him until the end. Long before he became Hoss Cartwright, Dan was just a young man from Texas who found himself dropped into the chaos of the Korean War. It was here, in the icy trenches and shattered villages of Korea, that the seeds of his surprising future were planted. And it's here where we discover a contradiction at the heart of the man. A soldier who would one day avoid even pretending to aim a weapon in real life. Dan enlisted in the U.S. Army during the Korean conflict and served with the 45th Infantry Division, known for its heavy combat and high casualties. He wasn't just stationed there. He saw real action, real loss, real trauma. For someone like Dan, who was naturally kind-hearted and introspective, that experience was more than just formative. It was life-altering. He earned a Purple Heart after sustaining injuries in combat. But the physical wound wasn't the one that stayed with him. What lingered was the moment he realized how fragile life really was. He'd seen men, both enemies and friends, fall within seconds. And he never forgot what it felt like to take cover, knowing the only thing between him and death was timing and luck. After returning home, Dan made a quiet but firm decision. He would never again willingly raise a weapon toward another human being, not even in fiction. It was a rule he carried into his Hollywood career. This choice set him apart in a genre that celebrated gunslinging heroes. Despite starring in a show where guns were practically extensions of each character's hand, Dan personally refused to glamorize violence off-screen. He banned hunting on his property. He declined to own firearms. And on set, he only used them when absolutely necessary for the script, never as props he took pride in. For a man playing a cowboy, this was almost unheard of. It wasn't a political statement. It was a moral one. Dan had stared down the barrel of war, and what he saw didn't align with the values he wanted to live by. While other actors might collect firearms or brag about their shooting range accuracy, Dan preferred his peace to come from silence, family, or the roar of an engine rather than the crack of a rifle. In many ways, this aversion to violence, rooted in first-hand war experience, made Dan more complex than the characters he played. He wasn't just acting when he played Hoss with kindness and restraint. That was him. The war stripped away any glorification he might have had about conflict and replaced it with something deeper, a belief in gentleness, restraint, and control, even as a towering, physically intimidating figure. But that discipline, that need for focus and precision, he didn't lose it when he put down the gun. He simply redirected it into a passion that required just as much control, calculation, and courage. And what he turned to next wasn't just surprising. It was fast, dangerous, and oddly therapeutic. Because Dan didn't need a weapon to feel power again. He found it under the hood. Dan Blocker might have been best known as the slow-talking, warm-hearted giant of Bonanza. But once he stepped away from the set, his personality shifted into something far more high-octane. Quietly, and without much fanfare, Blocker poured himself into a world that couldn't have been more different from the dusty frontier of the Ponderosa Ranch, performance racing. It wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession, a need for speed that let him escape the spotlight, focus his mind, and push the limits in a way that no script ever could. It started innocently enough. Dan had always admired the sleek lines of a muscle car, the way it could roar to life and leave everything behind in a cloud of burnt rubber. But admiration quickly turned into ownership, and ownership into competition. One of his most prized possessions was a 1965 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 396 Z16, a car so rare and powerful that even muscle car fanatics today treat it like a legend. Blocker wasn't just buying it for the looks. He knew what he was doing. Then there was the Genie MK10, a race car made for serious drivers only. Dan didn't just drive it. He raced it in real road racing circuits like Can-Am and the U.S. Road Racing Championship. That's right. While most of his fans thought he was just another Hollywood actor with a toy collection, Blocker was out on the track, competing with real racers, putting real rubber to the pavement at terrifying speeds. And here's the twist. He was actually good. For a man built like a linebacker, Dan had the calm, calculated nerves of a professional driver. He wasn't reckless. He didn't show off. Instead, he approached the track like a battlefield, disciplined, focused, and fearless. The same mindset that helped him survive combat now helped him master the art of racing. Behind the wheel, he was in complete control, a feeling he'd lost during the chaos of war and the pressures of fame. But more than just an escape, racing gave Dan something personal. It let him reclaim his identity. On the track, no one cared about Bonanza or Hoss. No one expected a catchphrase. No one asked for autographs. It was just him, the machine, and the blur of the road ahead. It demanded his full attention and gave him an outlet for all the emotions he kept buried deep under the surface. Even his family saw the transformation. Friends recalled how Dan would light up when talking about his cars, grinning like a kid while explaining upgrades, tuning engines, or recounting close calls on the track. It wasn't a midlife crisis or a celebrity stunt. This was where he found peace, ironically, through controlled chaos. And yet, this hobby was kept mostly under the radar. Unlike many celebrities who flaunt their collections, Dan stayed quiet, humble, focused. It wasn't for attention, it was for balance. The man who played Hoss needed to feel something real again, something raw and unscripted. Racing gave him that. But Dan's intelligence ran deeper than most fans realized. His passion for speed wasn't just thrill-seeking. It was deeply calculated. And the next part of his life proves just how sharp, strategic, and surprisingly academic this so-called cowboy really was. Most people took one look at Dan Blocker and assumed they had him figured out. He was big, broad, and booming, perfect for playing the lovable but sometimes slow-witted Hoss Cartwright. But the truth is, Dan Blocker was one of the most intellectually sharp and quietly ambitious actors of his generation. Beneath the cowboy hat and behind the easy laugh was a man with a mind as formidable as his frame. He didn't just stumble into fame. He thought about every move he made. And long before Hollywood came calling, he was on track for something entirely different: academia. Born in 1928 in DeKalb, Texas, Blocker wasn't raised in a world of entertainment. He grew up working hard on the family ranch, but it was clear early on that he had a natural curiosity that set him apart. After high school, he enrolled at Hardin-Simmons University and later transferred to Sul-Ross State Teachers College. His major? Speech and drama. But this wasn't just about stage performance. Dan was deeply invested in understanding people, communication, and education. He didn't just want to perform. He wanted to teach. And he did. Before ever setting foot on a professional set, Dan Blocker was a school teacher. He taught high school English and drama, even coached football for a time. He reportedly considered pursuing a doctorate in literature before fate, or perhaps coincidence, changed everything. One day, while making a phone call from a booth on the street, a talent scout happened to spot him. His size, voice, and presence were unforgettable. He landed a few small roles and eventually caught the attention of producers in Hollywood. Just like that, his teaching career gave way to acting. But he never left that thoughtful, teacherly mindset behind. Even as Hoss, Dan brought a layer of depth and emotional intelligence to the character that wasn't on the page. He studied scripts closely, sometimes rewriting his own lines to sound more authentic. He understood rhythm, timing, and how to make an audience feel something without overacting. Colleagues described him as fiercely intelligent and surprisingly philosophical. He didn't waste words, and he always listened more than he spoke. Blocker also had a sharp business sense, something not all actors of the time could claim. As his career took off, he began investing wisely and making decisions that would ensure his family's financial security long after Bonanza ended. He wasn't chasing fame. He was building a foundation. And it's this kind of thinking that eventually led him into another world entirely, the food industry. But we'll get to that. What's important to understand is that Dan Blocker's life wasn't a string of random lucky breaks. Everything he did, from teaching to acting to racing, was rooted in thoughtful intention. He didn't buy into the macho cowboy persona Hollywood sold. He questioned it, challenged it, and ultimately created a version of masculinity that was defined by kindness, intelligence, and depth. And just when it seemed like he'd settled into his role as an actor, Dan made another unexpected move, one that would surprise fans even more than his passion for racing. He became a businessman, but not just any businessman, one with a vision, a brand, and a steakhouse empire. If there was one thing Dan Blocker knew how to do, it was surprise people. Just when fans thought they had him pegged as the gentle giant from Bonanza, he'd pull another unexpected move. And one of the most surprising was his foray into the restaurant business. That's right. In the middle of a successful acting career, with millions of viewers watching him every week, Dan Blocker quietly laid the groundwork for something entirely different: a Texas-style steakhouse empire. It wasn't a vanity project. It was strategic, personal, and strangely poetic. The idea was simple but bold. Combined the rugged charm of the Old West with the comfort of hearty, down-home cooking. In 1963, Dan launched his first Blocker's Steakhouse, partnering with Dallas businessman Carroll Shelby. Yes, the same Shelby behind the legendary Cobra cars and restaurant expert David M. Pitts. Their goal was to create a franchise that brought real Texas flavors to diners across the country. They weren't just selling food. They were selling a feeling, warmth, hospitality, and the kind of old-fashioned service you'd expect if Hoss Cartwright invited you over for dinner. But Dan wasn't just the celebrity face. He was hands-on. He helped shape the menu, the branding, and even the restaurant's rustic design. He wanted it to reflect who he was, not just the actor, but the Texan, the family man, the guy who believed that a good meal could bring people together. Blocker's Steakhouse wasn't built on hype. It was built on heart. And here's the wild part. It worked. At its peak, Blocker's Steakhouse was drawing crowds not just because of the name, but because the food and experience were genuinely good. Customers loved it. Critics were surprised. And Dan? He didn't gloat. He just kept building, investing, and expanding. For Blocker, the restaurant business was about more than money. It was about legacy. He knew the fame for Bonanza wouldn't last forever. Shows end, audiences move on. But a business, something real, rooted in community, that could outlive him. And that's exactly what he was working toward. He once said he didn't want his kids to rely on TV money. He wanted them to have something tangible, something built to last. Of course, the restaurant world came with its own challenges. Managing staff, dealing with suppliers, juggling multiple locations. It was a grind. But Dan thrived on that. He liked working behind the scenes. He liked creating something outside of Hollywood's control. It gave him the same satisfaction as racing. Focus, discipline, and results. But perhaps the most meaningful part of his steakhouse venture was how grounded it kept him. While other stars drifted into ego trips and excess, Dan Blocker was spending weekends walking through his restaurants, shaking hands with customers, and checking in with cooks. He never saw himself as above anyone, just as a guy who'd been lucky enough to live many lives in one. But Dan's sense of balance wouldn't last forever. Behind the success, the family, and the racing, something else was brewing, something no one saw coming. And the way it all ended, that would shock the world. Dan Blocker lived big, in personality, presence, and purpose. But the ending to his story came fast, unexpectedly, and with a silence that echoed far beyond the set of Bonanza. At the height of his fame, with his business ventures thriving and his family by his side, Blocker's life was tragically cut short. The man who had survived a war, built an acting legacy, and chased peace through horsepower and hospitality was gone in an instant. And Hollywood was left in shock. It happened in May 1972. Dan had gone in for what was supposed to be a routine operation, gallbladder removal. He was just 43 years old, healthy by most accounts, still full of life and plans. But complications arose. A pulmonary embolism, a sudden blockage in the lungs, ended his life before he even had a chance to recover. There was no warning, no drawn-out illness. Just gone. The news hit like a punch to the gut, not just for fans, but for everyone who had worked with him. Bonanza wasn't just a TV show. It was a cultural institution. And Dan Blocker, as Hoss Cartwright, was its heart. He was the moral compass, the emotional center. His absence left a hole no writer could fill and no character could replace. Behind the scenes, cast and crew were devastated. Michael Landon, who played Little Joe, was especially heartbroken. He'd been close to Dan, on and off set, and reportedly wept when he got the call. Lorne Greene, who played Ben Cartwright, said it was like losing a son. The show's tone changed. Even the audience could feel it. Bonanza tried to carry on, but it was never the same. Within a season, the long-running series ended. Not because ratings had dipped, but because the soul of the show was gone. Blocker's funeral was private, attended by family, close friends, and a few cast members. There were no cameras, no media frenzy, just quiet mourning for a man who had touched lives without needing to dominate headlines. True to form, Dan had always kept his ego in check, preferring impact over image. In death, he remained the same, dignified, deeply loved, and quietly powerful. What made his passing even more tragic was how much he had left undone. plans to expand his restaurants, racing goals, a potential directorial debut, more time with his 4 children, whom he adored. His son Dirt Blocker would later follow in his footsteps, becoming a successful actor himself. But Dan never got to see that. Never got to watch his legacy unfold beyond the role that made him famous. Still, the impact he left behind didn't fade. Fans continued to write letters. Reruns of Bonanza kept his spirit alive. And in the world of TV westerns, no one ever quite filled the space he left behind. Hoss wasn't just a character. He was a reflection of the man playing him, loyal, thoughtful, and full of quiet strength. But there's one last part of Dan's story most people still don't know. A final, touching detail that proves he wasn't just a star. He was something even rarer in Hollywood, truly grounded. Fame is a strange thing. It elevates people to mythical status, warps their identity, and often disconnects them from the very humanity that made them lovable in the first place. But Dan Blocker wasn't interested in being a myth. He never let the spotlight melt away who he really was. And behind all the scripts, cameras, engines, and business ventures, there was one surprising hobby that kept him grounded: gardening. Yes, you read that right. While millions saw him as Hoss Cartwright, thundering across the screen with his 10-gallon hat and oversized heart, Dan Blocker was happiest when his hands were in the dirt, tending to a quiet garden tucked behind his home. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't public. It wasn't something he bragged about in interviews. But to those who knew him well, it made perfect sense. For Blocker, gardening was more than a pastime. It was therapy. A private sanctuary where life slowed down, where problems didn't talk back, and where he could breathe. He often said that planting something and watching it grow gave him a kind of satisfaction no Hollywood success ever could. It reminded him of his roots, growing up in Texas, where hard work and nature were part of everyday life. He'd spend mornings out there before heading to the studio, kneeling down, inspecting new growth, trimming, watering, methodical, present, focused. Sometimes his kids would join him. They'd plant tomatoes or help weed a row of squash. It wasn't about the harvest. It was about the process, a routine that kept him centered when everything else in his life moved at lightning speed. This garden was a sharp contrast to the life he lived in public. On screen, he was loud, imposing, always at the center of the scene. But out there among the vines and flower beds, Dan was quiet, reflective, even a bit philosophical. He once told a friend that a man's garden showed the truth about who he was. "You can't fake patience or care out here," he said. "You either show up or it all dies." Even after his racing wins and steakhouse expansions, Dan always returned to his garden. He said it was the only place that didn't expect anything from him. No lines to memorize, no persona to maintain, just the sun, the soil, and a man doing something for no one but himself. That's what made it so pure. And in a poetic twist, after he passed away, that same garden became a place of remembrance. His family kept it alive, not out of obligation, but because it felt like a living part of him. The tools he used stayed where he left them. The plants he nurtured kept blooming, as if the ground itself remembered his touch. In the end, it wasn't the cars, the fame, or the fortune that defined Dan Blocker. It was this quiet devotion to life's simplest rituals, a grounding force that reminded everyone close to him that under all the layers of a television icon was a man who just wanted to grow something real.